Attention, please. I'd like to start by thanking you for coming to the 5th annual Emerging Scholars Seminar Series. I'd like to also thank our 3 sponsors for this event. I'd like to thank the Student Government Association, the Graduate School, and the School of Public Affairs, who generously provided the funds for us to have the 5th annual Emerging Scholars Series. Yeah. We're delighted to have Dr. Melissa Mary here to share her research with us today. Dr. Mary works at the intersection of information technology and political discourse, focusing on framing. Her latest work is she's almost done with a book on the role of social media in the gun policy debate in the U.S. I think it's focused on the U.S., correct?
Yeah.
Okay. One other thing. If you have not RSVP'd, I'm going to have this sign-up sheet going around. If you are not affiliated with the university, you for sure have an RSVP. If you do not know if you've RSVP'd, err on the side of not having RSVP'd and sign the sheet. All right, so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Mary.
Okay.
And at the end, we'll have, this is supposed to go to 2:45 on the sheet. I think that's a bit ambitious. We're going to go to 2:30. Dr. Mary is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have about a half hour of Q&A. That last 15 minutes, if you'd like to talk to Dr. Mary informally afterwards, that's all right, but let's say going to 2:30. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, and thank you for inviting me. This is my first time presenting this book project as a whole, so I'm very excited to share what I've been working on for the past year. The book is tentatively titled Narratives, Distortion, and the Framing of Gun Policy. It's due to the publisher April 30th, so any feedback is welcome and appreciated, and I might actually make it into the manuscript. And also feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions or comments. That's totally fine with me. And I think that works. Okay, so I'll just dive right in with my central argument here. So I argue that the gun policy area is what I call warped. And what I mean by this is that both gun rights and gun control groups, they develop frames or policy narratives in sort of strategic ways to sway public opinion, to build their coalitions, etc. And there's an inherent logic to this. It totally makes sense. And in doing so, they systematically distort the nature of the policy problem. And in particular, I argue that they focus on atypical characters and settings. So to sort of preview some of my findings, gun control groups disproportionately focus on white victims, child victims, and mass shootings. And on the gun rights side, they disproportionately focus on gun owners as victims and self-defense situations in which they themselves use a gun to protect themselves or other people. And these are both distortions. So the reality is that the most common cause of gun fatalities is suicide. That is about 2/3 of annual gun fatalities. Mass shootings comprise less than 1% of these fatalities. And overwhelmingly, the vast majority of victims of gun violence are racial minorities. So these groups are not talking about race. Okay, so in some ways, this critique isn't necessarily new, at least since Columbine. Commentators have been talking about the fact that the media disproportionately focuses on mass shootings and excludes and ignores other forms of gun violence, and the media has often been criticized for ignoring minority victims. But no one has systematically turned this critique to interest groups, and there's been a lot of research into gun policy interest groups, but there hasn't really been a systematic examination of how these groups treat race in their communication. So I'm sort of filling those holes. So in addition to arguing that this policy debate is warped, I argue that there are some negative consequences both for policy making and politics. So as scholars of public policy, we know that policy problems and solutions are interrelated. And the way you define a problem has implications for the types of solutions that get selected. So I argue that this warping process has some ripple effects throughout the policy cycle. For example, so when you're focusing on just one small facet of a policy problem, then the solutions might not be designed to adequately address the major causes of the problem. They might be sort of piecemeal or even irrelevant. So if our focus is on school shootings, then the policy solutions that often get talked about are armed security in schools. Well, that's great for the schools, but what about all the gun violence that occurs elsewhere? And what about the other causes of gun injuries and deaths? So that's not going to have a major impact on those causes of gun violence. So that's one sort of policy making implication. And then in terms of politics, there are a number of negative consequences. And I argue that these are more serious for gun control organizations. So one of the implications is limited prospects for building broad-based coalitions. So on the gun control side, they're focusing on these high-profile mass shootings with mostly white victims. So what message does that send to African Americans? It definitely does not build a diverse gun control movement, and it might alienate some African Americans. So you're not building a diverse, broad-based coalition. I also argue that this warping can fuel the fundamental distrust that we see between the two sides on this policy debate. So, for instance, when a mass shooting happens and gun control groups talk about background checks, which is a policy solution they've been advocating for a long time. And it makes sense, they're sort of taking advantage of the enhanced salience of the issue to advocate for a solution that they think will help to prevent some acts of gun violence. But the gun rights organizations can come back and say, okay, well, in this instance with this perpetrator, that person actually passed a background check, and there's no way you could have prevented that shooting. So that leads these organizations to sort of question the motivations and intentions of the gun control organization. And this also sort of fuels the major arguments against a lot of gun regulations, which is they're just not going to be effective, right? There's nothing you can do to stop somebody who's intent on committing an act of violence. So there's sort of the distrust component that I argue creates a disadvantage long term for these organizations. Okay, so this idea of a warped policy debate is sort of a general idea. I think this can be studied in a number of different policy areas. So let's talk about why I think gun policy is a good case study for this. One reason is that it's a sort of a multifaceted problem. It's a complex policy problem with multiple causes. And that means that it can be framed in many different ways. And it's sort of sad to think about. There's a wide range of people who are victims of gun violence in one way or another, and a wide range of settings and circumstances in which it occurs. So there's many different ways to construct policy narratives. There's many different frames that can be used to talk about it. Second, framing is pretty well established to be central to the politics of gun policy. So this is a highly salient issue. It plays out in full public view, and these organizations on either side of the debate are actively seeking to sway public opinion, to expand their bases of support, to mobilize their activists, and they're using various communication venues to do this. And so framing is central to this process. And there has been actually there's quite a bit of research examining the framing of gun policy. But there are some weaknesses with it, so I think there's room to expand our understanding of the dynamics here. So a lot of this research into framing focuses on general themes or topics or arguments for or against gun regulation. And to give an example, a book that I really respect, I think it's sort of really done a lot to sort of flesh out the dynamics of the gun policy debates, Kristen Goss's book, in which she talks about the crime control frame, which she argues sort of predominated throughout the 20th century, and I argue is still really the dominant frame for the issue today. And that frame focuses on keeping guns out of the hands of quote-unquote dangerous people. And this is an important sort of frame to understand, but it doesn't really get at the nature of policy narratives. And then you have all these studies that are looking at frames, but they're defining frames in different and inconsistent ways. So there's sort of a need to develop a framework that can build sort of cumulative knowledge across study. So what am I doing? I am trying to study this in the most comprehensive way possible by examining a large number of interest groups. So previous research usually focuses on two groups, one on each side, usually the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence and the NRA on the gun rights side. So I'm studying 9 gun control organizations and 6 gun rights groups, and I'm trying to go for as much diversity on each side of the issue as possible. So I have the legacy organizations that formed in the 1970s on the gun control side, the Brady campaign, the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. I have newer organizations that formed in the aftermath of mass shootings, Sandy Hook Promise, Giffords, I refer to it as Americans for Responsible Solutions, but it was formed by Gabrielle Giffords after that incident, and Gays Against Guns, which is a small organization formed after the Pulse nightclub shooting. Also, there's sort of a diversity of approaches. So for instance, Cure Violence is a group that treats gun violence as a public health threat and tries to sort of stop the transmission of it, and their focus is actually on urban communities and racial minorities. So there's some diversity in sort of approach and ideology. On the gun rights side, this is a little bit of a different policy community in that it is dominated by the NRA. That sort of crowds out other types of organizations, although there are several other groups that are active. So the Gun Owners of America, for instance, so the NRA has about 5 million members. The Gun Owners of America has, at least they claim, about 1 million members. And they also claim to be the no compromise gun lobby. So they sort of try to set themselves apart from the NRA. It's a little bit even more extreme than the NRA. So there's some diversity in ideological approach and tactics. So I'm just doing my best here to get the most full picture. And what am I studying? I'm looking at communications in 4 forums. So blog posts, emails, press releases, and Facebook posts. The data span 2000 to 2017. The early years are mostly press releases, so from 2000 to 2007. The fullest coverage in terms of number of communication forums and groups is from 2013 to 2017. And I collected blog posts and press releases from groups' websites. I got emails by signing up for groups' email lists. And then for Facebook posts, I use this really cool tool that I found called Facebook Loader. It's created by the University of Oslo, which allows one to download unlimited Facebook posts into an Excel file in a very easy and readable format. So that's how I got nearly more than 58,000 Facebook posts, and then the total N here is nearly 68,000 communications. To study these, I can't really do a lot in terms of manual content analysis, so I'll talk a little bit about this later, but I use computer content analysis. I do want to talk about the theoretical lenses that I'm using to study group communication. So I have 2 major frameworks from policy studies and one that is more general to political science and social science. And I'll say, I'm sure many of you are well familiar with the narrative policy framework and the social construction of target populations. So, but I will do a little summary of each of those, as well as critical race theory. These theories haven't really been utilized in combination with each other, though I argue that they really complement each other. in helping to explain why groups frame the gun issue the way they do. So starting with the narrative policy framework, this basic starting assumption is that we understand and interpret the world through narratives. And these can then be used in politics to sway public opinion and shape the nature of the size and composition of political coalitions. And these narratives have structural elements that are present across context. So there's usually a setting, characters, a hero, villain, victim, a plot, and a resolution. And NPF operates at 3 levels of analysis. My focus is on the micro and the meso level. The micro level is the level of the individual and how individuals are persuaded. And one of the core hypotheses is that characters are central to the persuasive power of narratives. So they evoke these emotional responses in people. So it makes sense that at the meso level, groups would utilize characters. At the meso level, this is sort of the group level. Political coalitions use narratives to either expand or contain the scope of conflict. And so the conflict expansion strategy involves usually groups on the losing side of an issue who want to bring in more sympathetic participants to their side with the hopes of destabilizing the existing status quo or power arrangements. Conflict containment, usually associated with groups on the winning side who are happy with the status quo and want to keep it that way. Therefore, they don't want to draw attention or critical attention to it, and so they employ narratives to sort of frame issues as isolated problems and to keep people from paying much attention to them. So I developed a couple of hypotheses that try to drill down into how groups use characters for either conflict expansion or containment. And one of the factors that I focused on is a concept of proximity, which is pretty well established in social science research and cognitive psychology, is something that matters to people. So we are more likely to care about issues that we see as personally relevant, i.e. that hit close to home. So that's this idea of proximity. And it can be literal or figurative. So it can be, we care about the issue because it actually affects our community where we live, or we care about the issue because it seems close to us, or it evokes a feeling of closeness because the people are somehow similar to us, or the settings in which the issue is happening resemble the spaces that we routinely inhabit. So it can be both literal and figurative. And from this, I developed 2 hypotheses, one for conflict expansion and the other for containment. So I argue that political coalitions that are trying to sort of bring in more sympathetic participants, i.e. to expand the scope of conflict, are going to focus on characters and settings or locations that have high perceived proximity to their intended audiences. So they are places that people recognize and characters that people identify with. The opposite strategy for conflict containment is to make the problem seem as distant as possible by emphasizing settings that seem far away and characters who seem foreign or distant. So that's a first set of hypotheses based on utilizing this narrative policy framework. I also then bring in the social construction of target populations to get at another factor that can influence how groups use characters. And so just sort of briefly summarize this framework for anybody who's not familiar with it. This is Schneider and Ingram's work that looks at how the targets of policy are socially constructed and how that influences policy design. Sort of starts with the assumption that elected officials want to get reelected, so they have to pay attention not just to the power of different constituencies and interests in society, but also how the targets of policy are socially constructed. And groups that are positively constructed, for elected officials, it makes sense to bestow benefits on those populations because it's viewed as appropriate. They can sort of score points with their constituents by, say, giving benefits to a positively constructed group like the elderly. Criminals, on the other end of the spectrum, are considered deviants. and therefore elected officials can score points by being tough on crime, for instance. And so to sort of look at how this factors into conflict expansion and containment, I argue that in a conflict expansion strategy, political coalitions are going to focus on positively constructed victims. They're probably going to also to downplay negatively constructed victims, and then the alternative strategy for conflict containment is to focus on, was probably not to talk about victims, period, because we don't want to draw attention to a problem, but when called upon, either to downplay positively constructed victims or to focus on negatively constructed victims. Okay, the last theoretical lens is critical race theory, and this is sort of transcending political strategies, but it's important to look at especially how race plays into this debate. So the sort of starting assumption with critical race theory is that race is a major pervasive concept in modern life, and has profoundly shaped U.S. history from the beginning of transatlantic enslavement and continues to influence resource allocations today. It's used to justify inequality and oppression and exploitation. And racism is still a major problem. So made a lot of gains since the civil rights movement outlawing segregation, and it's no longer socially acceptable to be explicitly racist. But that doesn't mean racism is gone, it's just much more covert. And to study this, scholars have developed different measures. So one of these is racial resentment. It's been used a lot in political science. It's a combination of anti-Black affect or sentiment with this idea that we get ahead by our own efforts and racism is no longer a problem. It's been shown that people who are gun owners and who are supportive of gun rights have higher levels of racial resentment. So this is a factor in gun policy. Another conceptualization is what's known as color blindness. So racial resentment sort of focuses on racism as an individual psychological predisposition. Color blindness focuses more on racism as a structural feature with material causes and consequences. And this is Bonilla Silva's work. He actually has sort of 4 common frames of color blindness. I only have 3 up here. So the first one is the most important, though, is sort of the foundational piece of this, and that is this idea in individualism and equal opportunities, or these abstract liberal ideals. So we get ahead by our own efforts. And then cultural racism, if there are unequal outcomes and racial disparities, well, that is the result of some cultural deficiencies, such as a lack of a strong work ethic, for instance. And then another piece of this is the minimization of racism. So racism no longer exists, and if you are claiming or trying to draw attention to racism, then you're quote unquote playing the race card. So this sort of third hypothesis, it transcends strategy. So this is not, it affects all, I argue it's sort of a cultural constraint on the rhetoric of gun policy organizations on both sides. So I expect both gun control and gun rights groups to pretty much try to avoid the race issue, and especially to avoid explicitly racist statements because that's considered socially unacceptable, but also to avoid anti-racist statements. So to avoid calling out, challenging racism, because if we're a gun rights organization, then that's going to offend our members with high racial resentment. Gun control organizations have, I would say, disproportionately white constituencies. And so calling out racism can make some people uncomfortable and cause them to challenge their own privilege, and they're probably not going to want to do that. So don't talk about race if you don't have to. Okay. So how does this translate to specific expectations? I have to figure out, okay, how is this going to, what are we going to see in the narratives in terms of particular character attributes and settings? With gun rights or gun control groups, I'm assuming that they are generally seeking to expand the scope of conflict because, at least on the federal level, they've been on the losing side for a while. I expect them to focus on white victims. They're proximate, they're positively constructed. Child victims, they are the classic worthy victim and vulnerable. So people are drawn to have sympathy for child victims. They're going to focus on gun violence in non-urban settings. So they're not going to look at the inner city. They're going to look at gun violence in the suburbs, in schools, for instance. And that's going to help them expand the scope of conflict. They're probably going to avoid suicide. So it's sort of a mixed case in that it is proximate, but it is the sort of the stigma around suicide means that it is negatively constructed. So I argue that's something that gun control groups are going to avoid. On the gun rights side, I don't really assume a conflict expansion or containment strategy. I basically let the data tell us what strategy seems to be dominant, because there really isn't a clear expectation based on prior research. So we might say that gun rights groups are on the winning side, and therefore they would want to contain conflict. But during the time period of this study, the Obama administration was sort of hostile to gun rights, so they sort of perceived themselves, I think, as losing. And in some of my other research, I found more of a conflict expansion strategy among gun rights organizations. So it's unclear exactly what the strategy will be. If they're trying to expand the scope of conflict, though, I expect them to focus on home and business owners as victims and on self-defense situations. But if it's containment that they're going for, then there should be a different focus. So they should be trying to push the problem away, looking at gun violence in urban areas, affecting mostly racial minorities. They're going to characterize the perpetrators as also as distant as possible, and unlike the quote-unquote law-abiding gun owners. And then they are not going to be explicitly racist, but they're likely to use some racial code words. So drug dealer, gangbanger, the list goes on. But there's a clear racial code to that language. Okay, I'm using automated content analysis, and the program I use is linguistic inquiry and word count. It allows for the analysis of written text, and sort of the output is percentages of a text that contains certain types of language. And one advantage of this framework is that it allows one to construct your dictionaries. So this is what I did. Different attributes of characters. I inductively used a process of reading through these documents and identifying keywords and sort of building each dictionary until I felt that it was mostly complete. And they sort of vary in terms of the number of words that they contain, but different attributes of characters and different settings in which gun violence can occur, so different types of gun violence. All right, now I think I can move on to showing you some findings. So I have some graphs, and then I also I have some illustrations, some specific quotations pulled from different communication forms to sort of give you a flavor for how groups are framing the debate. So starting with these attributes here, race, age, and gun ownership, the findings are pretty consistent with my expectations in that you see gun control groups focusing a lot on children, a lot more than gun rights groups. And then on the gun rights side, they are focusing heavily on gun owners, much more so than gun control organizations. So when they're talking about gun owners, it's probably not always in the context of victims. So that's something to keep in mind. But anytime gun control groups are talking about children, they are generally referencing victims. You'll notice that I'm keeping the Facebook communications separate from the non-Facebook communications. I just don't think it makes sense to aggregate them for purposes of presenting results because they're just so different. So many more Facebook posts, and there's a lot of noise that comes along with the signal in Facebook, so the percentages are going to just look different. But the results actually are quite similar between the non-Facebook communications and the Facebook. So you see again in the Facebook posts, the gun control groups are focusing on children, and the gun rights groups are focusing on gun owners. Okay, so children. This statement here, I think, is very typical of how gun control groups talk about children, and it really highlights the positive construction of mothers and children in the rhetoric of gun control groups. So every mother dreams that her child will grow up safe, healthy, and happy. Unfortunately, too many American mothers see their dreams for their children shattered by gun violence. So it's very dramatic. It is invoking sympathy, deep sympathy for these families, and drawing on that, the positive construction of mothers and children at the same time. To some extent, gun rights groups do a little bit of this as well. They talk about how guns can be used to protect children and how children can use guns to protect themselves. So the Armed Citizen is as a column from the group's flagship magazine, The American Rifleman, and it always describes a self-defense situation. So in this one, a would-be robber was fatally shot by a 23-year-old Texas man in the backseat of a car with his infant child. So minding his own business in the backseat of a car when he's called upon to protect his infant child. And in this one, a South Carolina teen who was home alone defended himself using his mother's gun. So what would have happened to that teen without that gun available in that particular moment? Okay, great. So I don't have an example for gun control groups because they're using it in a pretty straightforward way. They don't talk about it much. They do a little bit. So for instance, the Violence Policy Center is a think tank basically. And every year they produce a report about Black homicide victimization. They talk about it on the website and they produce a press release about it. So it's pretty straightforward. In gun rights communications, though, it's very bizarre. So they're actually, what they're doing is they're appropriating the language of civil rights to argue that gun owners are the true victims of bigotry and discrimination. And this was sort of a jaw-dropping press release for me to read. This is just one excerpt of it. I don't even want to read it out loud, but I'll read part of it. On the day our nation celebrates the life of one of the leading civil rights activists in the 20th century, Dr. Martin Luther King, it is an outrage that California law now treats gun buyers in much the same way that African Americans were treated in the South to prevent them from voting. So it's invoking this language of civil rights, but it's not talking about how Black people are discriminated against. Yeah, so it's very, this is not necessarily typical. It's just to the extent that they do invoke race, which is not often, this is how it comes up.
Cracker racist? What? California's treating gun owners that this is their statement like cracker racist.
It's a press release too.
Wow.
It's sort of, yeah. Yeah.
I'm surprised they use that term.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had trouble finding, there were many different passages from this press release that were as, yeah.
One of your first slides was all with all the organizations. Did this one not come up because they don't really have that much communications? For instance, very little do they ever bring up race. And the only ones you found were ones that don't necessarily communicate that much? Or do they?
No, they do a lot of communicating, but they just don't mention race that often. Yeah.
This is the group that's more extreme than the NRA. Is that the one you mentioned?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't remember if the Second Amendment Foundation is considered more extreme than the NRA. The two that are definitely more extreme are the Gun Owners of America and the National Association for Gun Rights. This is an organization that does a lot of legal stuff. So they do lawsuits. Yeah. Okay. So moving on from sort of the victims to the perpetrators. I have a general dictionary for perpetrators, and it appears that they talk about perpetrators in roughly the same proportions, but they're doing so in very different contexts. I have dictionaries for mental illness and terrorism, which are sort of two things that are associated with perpetrators of gun violence, and then also examining the use of racial code. And it's a little bit interesting in that it looks very similar between gun control and gun rights organizations. And I'll explain a little bit why that is. So these results are it's a little deceiving in that they look to be very similar, but when you actually look at how they're using these concepts, it's different. And very similar findings in the Facebook post. So how does racial code come up in the language of gun control groups? So I argue that it's sort of part of the crime control frame because there is this strong association between race and crime that anytime you talk about criminals, there is sort of a subtle racial code to that. So this could be any mainstream gun control organization. This is a statement that is very typical. We loopholes in our laws make it a lot easier for dangerous people to get their hands on guns. So we hear that phrase dangerous people. For a lot of people, that's going to evoke an image of a black person, just because of prevailing ideas. So it's part of this broader crime control frame, and that's mainly where it's coming in. They're not using the more explicit, the more obvious racial code. We are seeing that, though, to some extent from the gun rights groups. I don't want to overstate this because this isn't common, right? They don't do this a lot, but these are some examples. So drug gangs thrive in the Windy City. Common street criminals don't have any trouble arming themselves. I find this disturbs me a lot, especially taking an armed thug out of the gene pool. There's something that's disturbing about that. Yeah. And that, I don't want to this isn't how they talk routinely, but occasionally they do issue these kinds of statements that utilize racial code in this way. Mental illness is something that we've seen more interest in. So this just shows over time how you see it in the communications of gun control and gun rights groups, and it just sort of fluctuates. So you have this peak in 2007, Virginia Tech. You have another peak in 2011, Jared Lochner and Gabrielle Giffords. And then following the Newtown shooting, so Adam Lanza. So all mass shootings in which it was believed that the perpetrator had serious mental illness. And so both organizations, both sides of the debate, do address and talk about mental illness. And I argue that this is an example of warping because most people with mental illness are not violent. And people with serious mental illness are generally very unlikely to commit an act of gun violence. And I argue that it's sort of sucked into this crime control frame that gun control groups use. So the dangerously mentally ill become one more category of people that we need to prevent from getting access to guns. So that's a very typical statement that you might see from any mainstream gun control group. In the case of gun rights organizations, they're invoking this really to create as much distance as possible between people who commit gun violence and then the quote-unquote law-abiding gun owners. So they talk about these perpetrators as madmen and deranged monsters. I don't find much use of this terrorism frame. So their groups are not talking about terrorism as much as you might think. So sometimes they do. So again, it fits with this crime control narrative that we have to prevent people who are potential terrorists from getting their hands on guns. But I think the proximity idea helps us understand why they don't talk about it more. Because when we talk about terrorism, especially Islamic terrorism, which it just seems far away, it seems that the cause of the problem is distant, it's not our own problem. And we don't see on the side of gun rights organizations very often, though we do sometimes. So another sort of disturbing Facebook post from the Gun Owners of America. Only 7 ISIS soldiers inside the U.S. Actually, ISIS, you're down to 69. Now, since you just lost 2 in Garland, Texas. And then at the end of this open season, anyone sort of inviting people to take up arms against ISIS, I guess. Yeah. But talking about this, using this frame gets these gun rights groups into a little bit of trouble because when gun control groups say we need to keep people on the terrorist watch list who are not even allowed to fly, or they're on the no-fly list, why are we letting them get guns? Then the NRA is forced to say to go on the defensive, and these other groups as well. So the NRA doesn't want terrorists or dangerous people to have firearms. Any suggestion otherwise is offensive and wrong. So they're put in this like weird defensive position And then to argue their way out of it, they have to bring in an argument about due process, and it's very complicated. So I think that on both sides, they're not mentioning this as much as they possibly could, because it just complicates the narrative. Okay, so that's sort of characters. Moving on to setting. Not surprisingly, gun control groups emphasize mass shootings. So they talk about mass shootings in over 30% of their non-Facebook communications, whereas gun rights groups obviously emphasize self-defense situations. Similar finding in the Facebook post, so more than 10% of gun control groups talk about or mention mass shootings in Facebook posts. Okay, and I do want to give some illustrations of how urban violence plays into groups' communication. So where gun control groups talk about urban violence, they're not talking about how it impacts racial minorities. They're actually a lot of times talking about how it impacts law enforcement. So that's an ally of the gun control movement. A little misleading here in terms of the focus. And then on the gun rights side, they're doing it in sort of the way I would expect, which is to try to put as much distance between lawful gun owners and then what's happening in the quote-unquote urban inner city. So it's not gun violence, it's gang violence, right? So that is really trying to minimize and isolate the scope of the problem here. And another one from the same organization.
Oh, wow.
The city is earning the nickname Philadelphia because the mayor and city council think punishing law-abiding gun owners will somehow cause criminals to stop killing one another. There's a little bit of racial code in there, and say this is the good guy versus bad guy dichotomy, and we're the good guys over here, and those are the bad guys over there in this urban area. So, So hopefully I've shown you some examples of the way that this debate has become warped. And I spent some time in the book talking about, okay, well, what is the way forward? How could we shift the framing of the debate so that it's more constructive? And one possibility on the gun control side is to bring in the Black Lives Matter movement, which has actually been a pretty successful social movement in drawing attention to racial injustice issues and police violence. Of course, and so doing that would be a way to broaden the movement and to bring in that energy. However, there are going to be some obstacles to this. So, of course, talked about earlier, there's this tendency not to talk about race, not to bring that in. Members might be resistant to this, and then there is an historical alliance between gun control groups and law enforcement, and that is a huge obstacle because law enforcement has situated itself directly in opposition to Black Lives Matter. You see that in the Blue Lives Matter. It's a direct response against it. And then the last part of the book, I think about how this could be applied in other policy areas. So are there some specific characteristics that make an issue more likely to become warped? And I just offer some possibilities for issue attributes that could lend themselves to warping. So issues that are complex and multiple causes, that involve focusing events that constitute very extreme circumstances, polarized issue areas, social issues in which the policy narratives are very densely populated with human characters, policy areas with with vulnerable and worthy victims that are easily identifiable. So there's a tendency to then focus on those particular victims and perhaps not be representative of the entire scope of the problem. So that is my overview. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions or comments that you might have.
All right, we got a half hour for questions. I'd like to be the one to.
Yeah, I can. Do that. Yeah.
Why do you think when they talk about mental illness, someone hasn't stood up and said that suicide is part of this discussion? Because they always talk about it as though it's just deranged
Yeah.
psychosis and stuff, but they don't talk about suicide is also a mental
Right.
health issue.
I think sort of there's two answers to that. One is the stigma around suicide. And then the other is actually there are some groups that talk about it. So for instance, Sandy Hook Promise, they have made that part of their mission, focusing on mental health and wellness. So, and in some of their communications, it doesn't sound like they're a gun control group at all. They talk about the importance of mental health support. So I think there is a little bit of movement in that direction, but that's a newer organization and a much smaller organization, and so arguably it hasn't had a huge impact on the movement as a whole, which just has historically not talked about it. They talk about, it's in white papers and policy reports, so you can find that information if you dig for it on their websites, but it's just not in their Facebook posts. Right? Yeah.
Great talk. Thanks for sharing the research. As you were presenting the hypotheses and then moved into some of your assumptions about winning and losing coalitions, and you were talking about how the gun rights group didn't want to classify them either. It's really struck me because it's such a difficult kind of question to say who's kind of winning and losing in a policy debate. And we've kind of made some assumptions in the literature, especially some of the NPF literature and other policy change literature to say, oh yeah, we can easily determine who's winning and losing. And this issue really raises the point that it very much depends on kind of the snapshot in time, the perspective you're taking in terms of what you're winning and losing. And I'd just be interested in having you kind of talk through that a little more, especially from the gun rights perspective. Because I've also tried to follow some of the debates just anecdotally because I'm so curious about this. And I grew up in a small town. I have friends on Facebook from the high school I went to who are like, these crazy guns. I'm sorry if there's any crazy gun rights. But I read some of the stuff and I'm like, oh my God, why are they so fearful? Like you're on the winning side. You're the one who has all the rights here, but there's this perception that they're losing. And I don't know if it's the perception that they're losing the kind of cultural debate or something else. Like, what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, there is a sense that there's a culture war happening, and that it's sort of like the white male who's now like the victim in this broader culture war. So it's this mentality, and it's articulated by the leaders of the National Rifle Association. So if you the keynote speakers at their convention, they perpetuate this frame, and they have been doing it for a long, long time. So I think it's sort of become ingrained. It might also have something to do with race. So, when privilege is threatened, there's this just amazing saying backlash against it. You can see that with Black Lives Matter, so people have a huge problem with this. And they come back and say, actually, all lives matter, which is just completely misunderstanding sort of the nature of it. So I think it's sort of this sense of threat from and sort of the challenge to their privilege.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would say on the whole that the gun rights groups, like what I see more of than anything is that they are trying to expand the scope of conflict and suggest that we are under threat and we need your support. It's not as strong of I don't see that strategy as strongly as I do with the gun control groups, but that's what the data
There
shows.
is this message that people are coming to take away our right to bear arms.
Yes, they see that.
Even if there's no policy response that actually does that, there's this
Yes, they
framing,
believe.
so the framing then reinforces that.
Yeah, they believe that gun control groups are wanting to confiscate their weapons, that they won't stop until they get your guns. And so, yeah.
I have a question as exchange research. Again, maybe a bit from distance. I sometimes get the impression that there's also lots of identity politics involved. I mean, making it like a very strong signifier of your own identity to own guns, and maybe also towards your sentiments of pride in your heritage. And I wonder, do you find that as well in the discourse that you looked at?
Yeah, so I spent a bit of time trying to just figure out who is in each camp. So who are the core constituencies of the gun control groups and the gun rights groups? And there's not really good good, straightforward data on this. So you have to sort of take different sources. So there's participant observation that's been done looking at rallies for gun control, and it's, of course, it's almost all white people. And then I did some analysis of the websites and demographics on who visits the websites of these groups. And you see some interesting differences. And then there's just survey data on gun ownership and how it correlates to different demographic attributes. And then sort of gun policy attitudes and how it correlates to different demographic groups. And there's some clear distinctions there. So people who are supportive of gun rights tend to be white, male, conservative, Republican, disproportionately from rural areas in the South. So that would be the core constituency. And then the gun control supporters tend to be a little bit more racially diverse, more female, democratic, and not from the South, so sort of from the Northeast. And so you do see these divisions, and that suggests that there's an identity component to it that is really driving it.
Can I quickly follow up? And maybe it wasn't part of the research, no, but do you see also like different symbols they would use?
Like, what do you mean by
symbols, like perhaps to evoke symbols, maybe some would have more flags than others or something like that.
That's interesting. It's not part of the research, but yeah, I'd be interested to look into that. Would you think that gun rights organizations would be like waving?
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say
Waving the flag?
anything over. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Also German,
Yeah.
if I get the point. Because if you look at it like that, following up on what you said, they are on the losing side. We have an increased urbanization, globalization. So, because we see that in Germany, there are Nazi groups that kind of pop up, and they use this idea of the 1920s, 30s, when everything was fine, and like security. So, is that kind of is that reflected in their not so rhetoric?
Yeah, perhaps a little bit, maybe not explicitly in the same way that you see it in Germany, but yeah. So there's this idea that the Second Amendment, the right to own a gun, is like this fundamental right that precedes all others. So in order to protect the other rights that we have, we need this. And if everything gets crazy and our government is corrupt, if there's some rhetoric around, we might need our guns for a revolution, right? To overthrow a corrupt government, or at least keep the government in check. But there's always this possibility that we will use physical force. So that's a very strong part of it. Yeah.
I was just going to say, that was a big, similar thing was a big part of the Make America Great Again. When was that point that we need to do it again? And there was a survey, if you remember this, of people during the election, and I think it was like 1958 was the year.
That was when America was great.
And if you think about what 1958 was, it was nuclear families. Our image of 1958 from media in particular was white nuclear families in suburbia owning homes and the men were gainfully employed, supporting their family. I mean, it was that very, yeah, it's very, very.
Segregation and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
So, but because when there's possible explanation, they are on the side of it, it's just a human agenda there.
Right. Sort of the long-term demographics don't actually look very good for gun rights. So millennials and people like the generation younger than millennials, I don't remember what's something crazy. Yeah. If you look at the data, they are much more supportive of gun regulations. There's more urbanization, fewer people owning guns. And so I think the long-term demographic trends look better for gun regulation and gun rights.
One of the really interesting findings, I think, was the fact that gun control groups seem to be on the losing side, yet they don't seem to be expanding into the areas where they would be building those coalitions. For instance, working with Black Lives Matters and groups like that. I'm wondering, does the when the year was founded for the group, the newer organizations, are they they starting to expand into those areas, trying to build those coalitions?
Yeah, and there's more, I think they're less tied to sort of, they don't have an established brand in the same way that the Brady campaign has a brand. It's very sort of mainstream, not trying to rock the boat. But groups like Gays Against Guns, they don't care that they came out very much against Donald Trump. They have strong messaging in support of Black Lives Matter. They engage in civil disobedience and disruptive direct action kinds of tactics. And so we're seeing some of that. And I think we're also seeing a willingness of the younger, the kids, like the Parkland teens, they're actually trying to be somewhat inclusive in building their movement and bringing in the issues that affect minorities. So we're seeing some of that coming in. So far, I would say these groups are kind of on the fringes and they're more tangential, and their framing has not been adopted by the mainstream groups that are most likely to be quoted in the media, and they're sort of the major players. So I haven't really seen it come into the mainstream. I think it could happen eventually, especially with the momentum created by the younger activists and the newer organizations. Daniel and then Alan. Or Alan and then Daniel.
I'll go then you go, okay? So thinking about like strategies that we employ when we try to influence like the policy process, and having a dominant frame increases your likelihood of having the conversation be about what you want to talk about, increases the likelihood that policy change will reflect your interests. The fact that the blogs, the gun rights organizations did not have any blog posts speaks to me, and I'm wondering, blog posts are long form, right? They're getting communication out with not 140 characters, much more than that. And during our workshop this morning, we were talking about how Trump is effective at making simple and folksy kind of communication. And I wonder if it's a effective strategy that if gun control organizations could employ in order to make their try to take over the frame in order to push their interests forward. Why they do, maybe perhaps you could tell me like why don't they do that? And am I understanding why do you think there's no blogs for gun rights?
Yeah, so that was interesting. I mean, it's a little weird, but yeah. So gun control groups, they have more than they have. Some of them have blogs, but I do find it's a little bit problematic in sort of distinguishing blogs from some of these other media, because for some groups, actually their blogs are their press releases. So it says blog and that's part of their website, but what's in the content of the blog is the press release. So it's a little bit fuzzy in terms of distinguishing between these different types of communications. And some of the gun rights groups, their websites aren't as sophisticated. So they just don't have as much going on their websites. They look very old school, like this website must have been created in 2006, kind of a thing. And so some of the gun control groups are more professionalized with their websites, and that's why they have these blogs, these separate blogs. But the problem with the website is that you actually have to visit it. It takes effort. And so maybe you're right, that maybe the best approach here is to take advantage of social media in more effective ways. And one thing I talk about in the book is that what we're seeing comparing these two sides, the gun rights organizations are more cohesive in their framing. So their narratives don't vary as much. There's less variation on the gun rights side than on the gun control side. And I think there's a wider range of approaches on the gun control side. There's a wider range of frames, and that might be a strength. So tackling a problem from multiple perspectives. But in the framing aspect of it, I think it's a weakness because it's less cohesive. I think it's stronger, and there's some NPF research that finds this, that the winning coalition had a more consistent, coherent frame. And I think Republicans generally are just more, they're more disciplined and consistent with their framing. And liberals, it may be because they just see more nuance in the world and more context and sort of bring more contextual factors into play. That's great for understanding issues, but it's not great for framing and for developing an effective message. So I think that's one thing that gun control groups could learn from the gun rights groups.
So I guess I have two questions. One would be kind of maybe pushing back a little bit on the Parkland side of things. It seems to me, I mean, yes, I know there's some talk of trying to have some broader involvement with other groups, but so far it seems like it's fitting pretty carefully into the same positive social construction narrative that seems to be after just almost every shooting. Mostly, I mean, school shootings in particular. Vegas was a little different because it was more random in a way. But it seems like it's fitting with that positive social construction frame of think of the school children. So I guess I'm not seeing where I mean, maybe this is a little cynical, but I'm not seeing where it's any different.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people are talking about how is this different, and oh, it's the kids speaking for themselves, and that's what makes it different, and it makes it more difficult to challenge their legitimacy as spokespeople on this issue. But you're absolutely right that it does sort of fit this bigger pattern that we've seen historically of increased salience following a mass shooting, with many of the victims are children. And one of the organizations that helps sort of organize the March for Our Lives was Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, which is part of Every Town for Gun Safety, which is very much a mainstream gun control group. And so in that sense, they're being influenced by that organization. And yeah, I would say there's more that's the same about the dynamic following that shooting than is different. But I have been encouraged. I started following some of these kids on Twitter to see how they're framing it, and they're retweeting African American gun control activists who haven't gotten much attention, right? So they're actively calling out the fact that there's this racial disparity in how we pay attention to this issue. So for me, more than the kids becoming the spokespeople themselves, that's what I find somewhat encouraging about it. But I don't expect any major policy change to come about anytime soon, right? The idea that this changes everything is not.
I definitely agree about having the victims/survivors speaking as the spokespeople. That is somewhat different. Although the domestic violence groups have been doing that for many years, but it just hasn't been done in this context as much. I guess my other question would be, how do you think it could connect with Black Lives Matter? I know for me, I think it does seem like there would be some natural, at least could get some common ground between gun control efforts and police, in terms of, if you think about it from protecting police, but I'm not sure beyond that
What is sort of natural,
where
the shared interests are. Yeah, and some people have argued there really isn't much of a shared interest. So, like, Michael Bloomberg, he formed Every Town for Gun Safety, financed it. When he was mayor of New York, he was the big stop and frisk, right? Mayor that disproportionately targeted minorities. And so there are some reasons to question whether there is a shared interest, but the Black Lives Matter people that are dying, they're getting shot, right? So they're victims of gun violence, are they not? And is there any sort of there's that piece of it, and then there's sort of like, okay, well, let's think about how does gun violence affect minorities, right? Can we expand businessmen are thinking about Black Lives Matter, just from police violence to this broader problem where communities are traumatized on a daily basis as a result of gun violence. So I think there's a potential there. A lot of obstacles. Yeah.
This might be a topic for the editorial process that you go through when you publish your book, but your hypothesis is that you would see both groups minimizing the discussion of race, and your data showed that, but your examples highlight race, which is more interesting for your reader, but you might get pushback because you're basically highlighting the small case. If you use those same type of quotations or examples, people might be like, yeah, but I thought that, or like connect it for people, like, yes, race is minimized, but this is how it does appear and why it matters. And, just so that you won't get pushback when you publish the book about what you highlight versus what the data.
Yeah. So to make sure that there's a consistency between the quantitative presentation and the qualitative examples.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's a good point.
And there is a fabulous book that does just what you were talking about. I'm struggling for the name. I got it off of our own program's criminal justice syllabi. It's about how gun violence in Black communities is not enforced. In other words, society allows murder to happen there in that context. It's a great book. If I think of it, I'll send you.
Okay, do send that to me.
It's really good.
Yeah.
I'm couch right now.
There's
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges or limitations of doing the automated media analysis.
Yes.
Something that some of our students and we have been doing, and
let's see. Go back to my. Okay. So one thing that just immediately came to mind is false positives. So for urban violence, I just listed all the cities in which that have high rates of gun violence, and that they were put in the dictionary. But I had to, any that sort of came back as positive or having any content in this dictionary, I had to go through manually, because I'm going to get, any reference to Chicago is going to fall into this category of urban violence, even if it's not about urban violence. It might be the Los Angeles Times gets quoted because there's that newspaper's name I have to. So there's an issue when you're doing data or when you're constructing dictionaries and relying on them. You're going to potentially have some false positives, and then on the other side of that, you're going to maybe miss some things that really do belong or should have been flagged. So maybe it's something that is contextual. It's very clear that we're talking about a domestic violence situation, but none of these phrases appeared. So that's not going to get picked up in the data. So those are the main, I would say, the main limitations. And then it does actually, there's a lot of time that gets put in at the front end here. So when you're doing manual content analysis, that's very time consuming. And it's throughout the process. Here, it's very time consuming at the front end to construct the dictionaries. And then you actually have to probably rerun the analysis several times, which I know I did, because I realized, oh shoot, that was an important term in the mass shooting dictionary, and I need to add that in. So then I have to rerun the entire analysis. I don't know how many times I did that. So it's not as much of a time saver as you might think. Although it certainly wouldn't be possible to analyze 68,000 documents without a tool like this. And there are some other approaches that I haven't used that I'm interested in investigating. So something called structural topic modeling, where you sort of feed the documents into an R package, and it analyzes the text for you and comes up with different categories of topics and identifies the keywords for you, of the unique words that fall within each of those topics. So that's something I'm didn't use for this project, but we'll probably want to look into in the future. Yeah.
Another question I have is whether you've seen much crossover into the issue of gun manufacturers, because they have a vested financial interest in keeping guns legal. And I was curious if that came up at all, since, and it does get a little bit of discussion, but there's also the laws on the books that protect them from lawsuits.
Right. So I did. It's sort of not really I didn't really focus on it at the time. I've certainly sort of read about it. So the gun control groups often talk about how the gun rights organizations are basically front groups for the gun manufacturers, right? So they get financial support from gun manufacturers. You can sort of think of them as lobbyists for the gun manufacturers. And then some of these groups are involved heavily in litigation. So there's, I forget what the law is called, but it shields gun manufacturers and those who sell guns, so people within the gun industry from lawsuits. And the Brady campaign is really heavily involved in some of those lawsuits. So that comes up in some of their press releases about ongoing litigation. But I didn't sort of incorporate it into this particular framework because it didn't sort of fit with the issue of the warped debate for me as much.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you weight your results in regard of the size of your dictionaries.
If I wait,
Yes.
no, I didn't.
Because your main category results are the biggest dictionaries right there.
Yeah. So the number, so that's an interesting point. I'll have to sort of see if I get any questions about that from reviewers, whether the number of words in the dictionary would affect the extent to which that shows up in the results. Some of the words are very unusual, so they wouldn't, just because the dictionary is large doesn't mean that a lot of those words are going to show up. It might just be a small set of those words that show up. So I wouldn't necessarily expect that would heavily influence the results, but it is something to think about, and I appreciate that. I will think about that and also probably look back through my dictionaries and see if that could potentially be a problem. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Thank you.
All right. Well, we have a little token of our appreciation for you coming in and
Thank you
taking
very
your time.
much.
It's a pleasure.
Aw.
Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming in. If you haven't signed the sign-in sheet, please do so before you leave. But yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Daniel, and Kathleen, and Barry.
Make a picture of you with your,
Absolutely.
and then maybe another one next to like.
Can we take a picture of you again?
For your person who told you that you need, we have like a giant. Oh, here.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have a preference for this way versus this way?
I have no preference.
I look good in portrait.
You want to be portrait?
Yeah.
The two.
How do you think it went?
That was awesome.
Yeah, the whole thing. Well, good. Yeah. Okay, yeah. I didn't get too much sort of negative feedback, so that felt fun.
This is Anna.
Hi, nice to meet you.
That was great.
Okay.
actually people with different interests in that too. So being able to talk about a lot of different aspects of research is probably successful.
Okay, good. Yeah. I didn't know, very sometimes if you're talking, about something that everybody already knows, that's a big drag.
No, but I thought that your really sort of very quick kind of overviews of the different theoretical classes, like.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm a nurse, so I still knew what was going on.
Okay.
So much
Yeah.
fun.
Only Melissa.
I think about the called ghetto side.
Okay, great, thank you. I have not.
Jill. Yeah, it's really good. All right, see you guys
Thank
later.
you for coming. Yeah.
All right, so what is the breakdown? We gotta get you your thumb drive.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.